Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And I think we're going to touch on all of those today with my guest, Brent Bennett, who is coming back for his second appearance on the Power Hungry Podcast. Brent, welcome back.
Thank you, Robert. Thanks for having me on again.
Now, I didn't introduce you. You are the, if I'm correct, Policy Director for Life Powered at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Is that correct?
Yep, still am.
Still. And your last on the podcast, in fact, it was 2 years ago, almost exactly 2 years ago, in early 2022. So you've been on the podcast. I think you've listened to it a couple of times. You know that guests on the podcast introduce themselves. So if you don't mind, please introduce yourself. Imagine you arrive somewhere, you don't know anyone, and you have about 60 seconds. Go.
Yeah, I wish I was as good at this as Jason Isaac, our director. But anyway, no, I born and raised in Texas, son of an oil and gas entrepreneur. So energy is in my blood. Grew up in Midland, and but wanted to do something different in college. So I actually in college and grad school. So I ended up getting a PhD in material science and studying batteries. So different side of the energy business. Did that. My first job out of school was working with a company here. Actually, we were helping to primarily build hybrid vehicle batteries. We were a material supplier. So that's kind of my entree into the world of EVs and batteries was through my school, and also my first job out of school. Through a circuitous route, ended up taking this job in policy. Mostly because I just didn't want to leave Austin. I'm sure you know how that is, right? You get stuck here.
Yep.
And but if after 5 years, I'm still doing it. So it's been a great ride, and now here we are after 5 years. I finally published a paper on EVs, and it gets more press than anything we've ever done. So it's kind of, I guess, the battery world is coming back into my life in a certain way. So. Great to get to do that and to talk to folks like you about it. And you've done so much great work on EVs yourself, writing about it, that I wanted, really wanted to come on here and talk about that. So
sure,
a lot of fun to
do. And when we've talked about material science and batteries before, when we've chatted here in Austin over lunch, and I think we talked about them the last time you were on the podcast. And your new report is called "Overcharged Expectations." You co-wrote it with Jason Isaac. Overcharged expectations, unmasking the true costs of electric vehicles. So I've read the report, but I'll let you. I mean, what are if you had 60 seconds again? Not that we are going to talk for an hour, but what did you find in this report, and what did you find along with Jason? What did you find that most surprised you? Because this report has been attacked by the EV supporters, of course. It's gotten some good traction, but what did you find that surprised you?
Yeah, we wrote the report because we knew that there was a lot more to the story than just the $7,500 federal tax credit, right? And the other things that have been added by the Inflation Reduction Act. So it wasn't a surprise to us that we uncovered more with regard to how the regulatory scheme of the fuel economy regulations, how that's used to benefit electric vehicles and subsidize them, and the utility costs. But I think it just surprises to what degree those costs exceed the $7,500 tax credit, right? That's the smallest piece of the pie, in a sense, in what we're paying to support EV production and also the charging of EVs.
So in terms of the socialized costs, right? I mean, there are
socialized costs, right?
It's the privatized savings versus the socialized costs. But I mean, if I were going to, as I looked at it, you arrived a couple of different ways, but the total cost. You said adding the cost of the subsidies to the true cost of fueling an EV equates to for an EV owner paying $17.33 per gallon of gasoline. And that number seemed to be the one you also calculated at $16.12. Those are big numbers. And that, I think, was what got one of the reasons why the paper got the attention that it did. Walk us through why those numbers are so high, because they are the attention grabbers, aren't they?
Yeah, exactly. And it comes out to, it's a little easier to imagine, it comes out to about $50,000 per average EV as what the cost of these, and not just the tax credits, but all the other regulatory favors and implicit subsidies, right? And yeah, and we put it in terms of the cost of fueling an EV in a sense. It's because not all of it is subsidies for charging, right?
Right.
Those do exist. That's about 20% of that, 20 to 25% of that a number is actually subsidies for fueling it, right? The socialized costs of infrastructure on the grid, and the direct subsidies for fueling infrastructure, things like that, right? But it just, again, what we really wanted to do is kind of put it in terms of a lifetime cost of owning an EV, right? Because that's what so much of the people promoting EVs say is like, well, it's more expensive to buy, but it's cheaper to fuel, it's cheaper to maintain. So over the course of the lifetime of an EV, and it kind of comes out even, right? And we cite a study that basically to that effect in the paper. But we kind of wanted to say, well, yeah, but if you were to, take the socialized cost, right, and add that to, you could add it to just the production cost, right, and say, okay, it's $50,000 more. But what if we just said, well, what if you were to take this and make it a lifetime fueling cost, right? And that's where we got the $17 per gallon number from, right? Is to basically say, well, if you wrap all these subsidies into just like a fueling subsidy, they're not, right? Some of them are subsidies for producing the cars, right? The regulatory favors is a production subsidy, basically.
Right.
Yeah. But if you just put it all in terms of fueling costs, just as to get a single number that's, kind of people can relate to, right? It's the equivalent of like saying you're charging your, if you were to pay for all the costs, it's like you're charging your EV at $17 a gallon, right? And they say, and they say that it's more like, $1.50 a gallon, right? But
Right.
that's not, A, that's not true in and of itself. And B, if you add all the socialized costs, then you're talking about a lot more than that. So that's kind of how we put it in those terms. And I think people, based on the reaction to the paper, I think both positive and negative, people can relate to that. They can relate
Right.
to just how big that cost is, right, when you put it in those terms.
Yeah. Especially when what the national average of gasoline today is, what's, $3 and change or something like that. It's in the
Yeah.
neighborhood. I mean, today it was
Uh-huh.
270 or something. You see those prices posted all the time. But one of the other things that seems to me, and this paper came out now last year, it was October of last year, if I'm remembering correctly. Since then, the EV hype seems like it's just starting to really subside. I mean, I'm looking at the stock price chart for ChargePoint Holdings, which is one of the companies that was, went public and claimed they're going to make a lot of money building EV chargers. Over the last year, their stock price has gone from $12 to now it's $2 flat, $2 even right today, and down 83% over the past year. So I'll ask the question this way: is the media hype around EVs really starting to collide with reality? Is this what is it? All the confluence of all these issues around insurance, around higher cost of ownership. Hertz just announced it's dumping 20,000 EVs. Ford, of course, is getting killed on their EV business, losing between $60,000 and $70,000 per vehicle they sell. Is it the collision of all these things, to use an automotive term, that's causing this fallout in the EV space?
Yeah, and of course, no one's written more or better about it, I think, than you have. But yeah, I think it's just all those things you said. It's really what's happening. Traditionally, we want good public policy comes after technology, right? So, for example, if you look at the Clean Air Act or the original fuel economy standards, right? Those were designed to say, okay, we're only going to implement regulations that are based on known technology, existing technology, right? We're not going to use the regulations to try and force technology, right? We're not using subsidies to try and force technology. And the mentality, especially in the federal government, in the last 20 years or so, has changed to where now we want to use technology or regulations and subsidies to try and drive technology adoption or creation, right? There's this idea that the government can somehow do that, right? But the problem, especially in energy, is that you run into basic physics and economics, right? You have the physics of EVs, the materials it takes to build them. Even as you gain economies of scale, there's still underlying, cost of the batteries and the materials, and it's hard for automakers to overcome that. And then you have the economics of, consumer behavior, what consumers want, how much they're willing to pay for things, right? So that those two things, you can't, there's no policy that can influence that unless you just have the government go and purchase all the EVs, right? I
Right.
guess you could give them away for free. Um, but then you create a problem of, immense debt, right? So there's always, economics and physics always govern what happens in the energy sector, right? As you know very well. And so I think
Well,
that's
well,
just
I
what's
like that what
happening
you
is
said about the
we're
tech.
yeah.
Well, if I'm going to rephrase what you just said, and correct me if I'm misapprehending, but I like that idea of technology should be leading the policy instead of the other way around. Instead, we've got
Mm-hmm,
policy trying to force the technology into the marketplace. And what I
mm-hmm,
see at this moment now in early 2024 is that the automakers are looking around and saying, "Huh, maybe consumers don't want these vehicles," and they're backpedaling in a big way and taking big losses, but a lot of those losses are going to be absorbed by taxpayers now. But the part that just leaves me stunned, really, Brent, is if I look at the automakers just as businesses, right, and talking about technology versus policy, that they didn't seem like they didn't understand the market very well. Now, I'm setting aside all the
yeah,
issues in your paper, but why didn't they understand that the market for EVs is going to be very limited? Because that's what it looks like to me, is that the hype is colliding with reality, and the automakers are looking around and saying, "Oh, not everybody wants one." And so, I mean, has that occurred to you, or have you given much thought to that about what the automakers themselves as business people thinking, "Oh, well, we'll just force feed these into the market," or it was because they were told by government? How do you see the automakers' role in this?
yeah. No, that's a great question. I was actually thinking about that same question as you were right before you said it. So you're reading my mind. No, and I was actually, the last time I did a podcast on EVs, I was opposite the chief sustainability officer at GM. And the point I made was is that, you know, the point I made was exactly that the market for EVs is going to be limited. And it's okay for, if GM says, okay, I want to go out and try and capture that market. The problem is when we try to force that with government policy, right? So that's, and to force everyone into an EV, right? It's okay to say that EVs are going to grow, EVs are going to be a big part of the market, and they're going to have a big market segment. I think they will in time, especially for, commuter vehicles, people like me who, commute 7-8 miles to their office every day. And, that's about it for the most part, right? But there's a lot of things, that EVs are not as good for: long distance travel, hauling, like the guys that come and, mow your lawn and having to haul a trailer, right? That's not a very good application for an EV, right? I mean, yeah,
Right.
Ford has their F-150 Lightning that can do that, but the cost of the battery for that gets more and more expensive the bigger it gets, right? So it's just, there's fundamental limitations as to how big that market's going to get. So I think that's really the problem, is that I think, the executives are not looking at the whole market, and they also have to cater to investors who are demanding, that they virtue signal and do the right thing with regard to EVs, right? They've all got to have their net zero plans now, right? Everyone has to have that. Well, you're not going to get net zero with just hybrids,
Right.
right? So you've got to go all in with EVs. And I think that mentality, again, was just that, well, we're going to figure it out, some way the technology is going to come and we'll make this happen. And they're realizing now, like, oh, like maybe it'll come eventually, but not in the next 10 years, right? And so now they're starting to backpedal. So I think
Yeah.
it's executives in some way, and I saw this in the executive that I was opposite to in this last podcast. I think they had the same problem as policymakers of thinking, well, we can drive the technology adoption, like we can, and it's just, that's not how, as a PhD scientist, or former one at least, like that's not how it works. It's the process of technology creation and adoption is very, we have a word, stochastic, meaning random.
Yeah.
You come across things and it takes time. Developing new battery technologies and bringing them to market takes at least 10 years usually. And that's how it was true for the lithium-ion battery in the 1980s and 90s, and it's still true today. So I think
let's
that's where
talk
we're
about.
coming into. Yeah.
Sure. Well, let's talk about batteries some, because I say about batteries, they're kind of like Goldilocks, right? Can't be too hot, can't be too cold, can't charge them too fast, can't
Yeah.
do everything has to be just right.
Just
So
right. Yeah. All
so
balanced.
Right. But it's just they're finicky, right? And I thought one of the funniest
Mhm.
things was in January, what was it, several weeks ago when it was super cold in Chicago. And there were news stories about people with Teslas finding, oh, my car doesn't work when it's really cold. And they are having trouble charging them. And I thought, well, who would have ever
Yeah.
thought about this? I mean, gee,
Uh,
imagine, the EV doesn't work as well in cold temperatures. So you've worked in the battery space, which gives you a different perspective on this. And we both know David Sadoway, right? Is that right? Or no,
Donald Sadoway,
Donald Sadoway at MIT,
MIT. Yeah.
who I met 15 or 20 years ago, and I've followed his work since then, right? He had the nickel, the hot molten metal battery that never was commercialized, and we talked about batteries and
Yeah. One
how
of the
do you
best out there, in my opinion. He's
yeah,
he's really good.
no, Donald Sadoway's great, but for all of his work and all of his effort, he still hasn't commercialized a battery, right? I mean, just for all of
Hmm.
that work, right? And he's a very smart
Yep.
guy, and I've had him on the podcast. What is the problem with batteries? Why don't they work better now? Why haven't we had this eureka moment in 100 years or more now, 120 years of EV history? Why do batteries
Yeah.
still suck?
Yeah. Well, and you make a great point. I mean, yeah, the 120 years of history. I mean, there was a time back in Edison's days when people thought that cars were going to be electric, right?
Yeah,
That electric was the future. Um, and it turns out that, the gasoline makes for a much better fuel than electricity.
right.
And I think that's the problem is that, the energy density of gasoline, the, the portability of it, the resiliency of it, right? It doesn't boil off or freeze at anywhere close to room temperature, right? So you
Yeah,
have a wide temperature range for it. I could just go on and on about how good of a fuel it is, right?
yeah,
Now, the the flip side is that gasoline engines are not nearly as efficient at converting that gasoline energy into movement as
yeah,
electric engines are.
right.
Electric engines are very efficient, right?
Yeah,
And they have
sure.
certain advantages to them. They have work really good at low speeds, right? Really efficient and have a lot of torque at low speeds. I mean, if you've ever driven a Tesla, I imagine you have. I mean, the acceleration is incredible, right?
Oh yeah.
So yeah, but again, the problem of trying to store electricity, as a and give and do that in a way that is comparable to the way that energy is stored in gasoline is just really difficult. And physically we'll never quite reach the energy density of gasoline in a battery. It's just not possible unless we invent new elements in the periodic table. It's not going to happen. So we're limited there. The
So
charging
so
time
so
is,
I
is,
so
some,
let me interrupt
is
you.
something that
So
is
but
limited by physics, right? So
but
I guess that's why is like we're running up against over time. We're running closer and closer to these limits, these hard physical limits on what batteries can do. And so each increment of improvement gets harder and harder. That's why, it's still, like I said, it took 10 years to develop the first lithium ion battery. And every new iteration of the lithium ion battery since then still takes 10 years to develop because each iteration gets harder and harder as we get up closer to those physical limits. So that's why it's so batteries are getting better, but there's just limits to how good they can be, right?
but what are those limits? I mean, you're a material science guy, so tell me why batteries still
Yeah.
suck. Why is it? What is it about the battery itself that we just haven't been able to improve? What is it about the thing of
Yeah.
that thing that well, you said the limits of physics. Well, how do you explain that?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, and you talk a lot about power density. I know you have a whole talk about that, but really it's two things. One is how much energy can you get into the battery, right? So that's limited by the materials that you can use, right? There's only so many electricity that you can pump into a battery and store it there in the form of chemical bonds, right? So that's the
there are
limit
only a
of
few,
energy.
and to follow up on your idea on the periodic table, there are only a few metals that are efficient at that or that are useful for that
Right.
process, right? So
Mm-hmm.
as
Right.
Sadoway says, you've got a, what did he call it, an assay, right? You can assay the periodic table to see which ones are the ones that are likely to be good. So you have a
Yeah.
limited number of elements that you can work with to make the battery, right? And it's a
Mm-hmm.
very few specific metals, and lithium is one of them, right? And so that's
Right. I mean, and lithium's the lightest metal in the periodic table, so we're not going to get any lighter than that. Now, we can use like sodium or aluminum that have some other properties that make them better. They're more stable. Um, and particularly aluminum, you can maybe charge your battery faster, but you're not going to get any lighter or more energy dense than what you get from lithium. Like that's it, right?
Gotcha.
It's the lightest element out there, and so yeah, there's only so many electrons that you can store in a lithium compound, right? So that's the energy density limit, and then also the power density limit is how fast can you pull those out, right? So you can only break bonds so quickly and pull electricity out so quickly, or put it in, right?
Right.
So and oftentimes those two things are counter to each other. If you can store more energy in a battery, but a lot of times in order to do that, you have to give up charging time, because you have to make the battery thicker. You have to change the design. There's just those two things, kind of energy density and power density, kind of work against each other. And so again, like, we can make nowadays batteries that are more energy dense than what exists in commercial developed, right? I can go in the lab and make one, right? But it's not going to charge. It's going to have to charge really slow, right? Or I can make a battery that charges really fast. Heck, a capacitor, which is just two metal plates basically that hold charge between them. We use capacitors in electric cars nowadays to help accelerate, to get that real quick charge out of them, right?
Right.
Like those are really good at charging and discharging really quick, but again, they don't hold a lot of energy.
Right.
So
and I like the way you talk about
that yang, is about to be balanced.
Right. So it's I was going to say yin and yang, the choreography, or the balance between energy density and power density, and you're going to have trade-offs if you go too far one way or too far the other way. And so now there's talk.
We're improving both, but again, it's at a very the rate of improvement, it gets harder and harder each step, because you run up against there's physical limits to how much energy you can store. There's physical limits to how fast you can pull it out, right? So that's I think we're improving those things, but each step of improvement gets harder than the last one, and so it's fundamentally just a slow process, and it always will be.
And that is due, as you talked about before, about just the limits of the physics and breaking the chemical bonds and putting them back, and the charge recharge, all those things that are colliding in a battery pack that for an automobile weighs 1,000 pounds, and it doesn't matter. That's the other part that Jesse Ausubel calls them Soviet cars, right? And he had a funny idea about it. Well, it's that, and he made that point because he said, well, look, whether they're full or empty, they weigh the same. Right. So it doesn't matter. Oh, well, they're fully charged. It weighs 1,000 pounds. They're empty. They weigh 1,000 pounds.
He has a great way with words.
Yeah. But I just thought that was an interesting way to think about the vehicle itself as a thing, right? That you've got this burden of weight that is just part of the characteristics of the battery itself. Whereas with jet fuel or gasoline, you're just burning it, right? The vehicle, the plane is getting lighter the further you go, right? And it's not in the overall weight of given, it's 6.5 pounds a gallon, something like that for gasoline, but the equivalent weight in batteries of that gallon of gasoline is massive. I don't know what the multiple is, what volume or on a gravimetric density basis, what 40x, something like that.
Yeah, 40 to 100x lower for batteries versus gasoline, right? So and you've got to haul that weight around with you everywhere, so that's the thing. That's why Teslas weigh 1,000 to 1,500 pounds more than your comparable sedan, right? And so that's an efficiency loss. Our new colleague Mark Mills at the foundation, he has a great paper about the environmental impacts of EVs, or the lack of environmental benefits, right? And that's one of the things he talks about, is that there's not just there's the embodied emissions in making the battery in the car, right? That there's a lot of emissions that go into that, and energy that goes into that,
right?
But then also, yes, you're using electricity, right? So there's no emissions at the vehicle, and your electric motor is very efficient. But on the back end, you're hauling a lot of weight around,
right.
And so that takes a lot of energy. That energy is coming from a power plant somewhere else that is likely burning fossil fuels, unless you're in like the Pacific Northwest where you have hydro. That's likely burning fossil fuels. So there's a lot of emissions there, and your energy benefit that from the efficiency of your electric motor is somewhat lost from the fact that you're hauling a lot of weight around. and you're having to burn some kind of fuel back here and transmit it into the car, before you actually turn that into motion, right? So there's not really a lot of efficiency gain in the whole system,
Right.
right? Even though electric motors are very efficient. And so the environmental impact is basically a wash in the end. You look at carbon emissions, you look at particulate emissions and other things. It's sort of a wash, and
Yeah.
that's yeah.
Well, and as I looked
That's
at
it right there.
looked at your paper, and I thought, okay, well, so I've written about EVs now for 15 years or so, and just
Way longer than I
I've
have.
been a skeptic all the way, right? Because of one, the long history, and I published it on my Substack, and I think you saw it, but it was just and testified before the Senate. Look, the Los Angeles Times was talking about this in 1901, right? There's nothing new under the sun. But as I read your paper, and I don't, this is just an observation, not a criticism. You don't even mention China. So we have the Chinese supply chains. You're talking about the subsidies and the costs, societal costs, socialized costs. Mill's work is on mining and upstream issues around the metals and the inputs, right? So there are all these different facets of the EV, the network system, the network of networks, right, that is required to produce them and then deliver them and so on. And it's an incredibly complex set of issues that are colliding right there within this one kind of iconic now idea around, oh, well, we're just going to electrify transportation. We're going to electrify everything. As you look back at this now and you look at, the media coverage of your report and, your history in batteries and dealing with this, why has there been so much media hype around this? And second, why do, I'm going to say, the Democrats and this administration, why are they so in love with this idea of the EV? What is it about the thing that they're so attracted to?
Yeah, like it's kind of almost it's almost religious, right? In the way that there's this attachment to it, despite, like I said, the data that's out there that, even in terms of achieving the net zero goals, right, which is ostensibly the purpose, right, of EVs, that that they probably aren't going to make a huge dent. I mean, you're only talking, probably passenger cars make up, roughly 10 to 15% of all of our carbon emissions. And if we can electrify all of that, that would be a darn near a miracle.
Right.
Not to mention heavy duty transportation, trains, airplanes, ships, all the other stuff.
Right.
So yeah, it's that's a great question that I've never really thought about, is like, why is, like, with wind and solar, I think we could talk about that as kind of the religious fascination behind that, which is that there's this, there's the renewable nature of it, right? Like there's a very strong ideology going back to, the early part of the 20th century and the start of the Industrial Revolution, that somehow there's something unnatural about our use of fossil fuels,
right?
And because we're burning them and we have to constantly replenish them, we're eventually going to run out, and that, so therefore they have a in the long run, they're bad for the environment because of that, right? That was long before climate change became an issue. Climate change was in a way, I think, an issue that was created to feed the ideology that already existed, right? Once we solved the problems of particulate pollution and things like that, then climate change became a big issue. So wind and solar kind of have that, nature where, again, because even though the materials to create them aren't renewable, because the fuel is renewable, therefore they have a, they're fundamentally better, right?
Right. Yeah.
I've never been able to figure that out with EVs, except just the fact that EVs run on electricity, right? So therefore EVs are better because they run on electricity, and you can power that electricity from wind and solar, which is the holy fuels, right? That's because it's, there's nothing, again, there's nothing renewable about electric vehicle compared to a gas vehicle, except that it uses electricity instead of gasoline, right?
Right.
Otherwise, the components are mostly the same, except for the engine and the battery, right?
Yeah.
And certainly, and nobody fools themselves that batteries are renewable, right? I mean, we can recycle. Granted, I think we're going to get a lot better at recycling them. I mean, lead acid batteries, your car starter battery, 95% of that is recycled.
Yeah.
The plastic, the lead, everything. I think we'll get there with lithium-ion batteries eventually. It's a lot harder problem to solve than lead acid. You can't just melt the plates down and
Right.
and then reform them the way you do with lead acid. But I think we'll get there eventually. I actually had a conversation recently with a guy in Indiana who's working on this right now. He's got a really cool technology for taking lithium and other metals out of batteries and all kinds of stuff, magnets. They recycle rare earth magnets, but it's still going to take a ton of mining to do this. So yeah, my long-winded answer there is to say that I don't really have an answer for why just the religious attachment to EVs versus, for example, if we went to hybrids, suppose we had a policy of subsidizing hybrids to the degree that we subsidize EVs these days. I mean, hybrids get $2,500 tax credit roughly. That's about it.
Yeah.
They don't get fueling subsidies the way that EVs get charging subsidies. They don't benefit that much from the fuel economy regulations the way the fuel EVs do, right? But we're still selling more hybrids than EVs in this country, and you can make a hybrid battery using 1/50th to 1/100th of the materials that it takes to make an EV battery. It's that much smaller,
Right.
And you get a 50 to 100% bump in your fuel efficiency
Right.
of your vehicle by doing that. So if you want to talk about what's best for for reducing emissions, hybrids went out by a long shot.
Yeah.
And there was a time, when they were the more popular item on the environmental left. I think because even then EVs were so far fetched, right? That
Right.
Tesla
the Prius became kind of that iconic vehicle for the
Prius. The Prius was the Tesla Model S before Tesla existed, right?
Right.
It was the it car to have if you wanted to virtue signal, right?
Right.
But the funny thing is that there are real advantages to hybrids. Like I said, I worked on building hybrid batteries, so I'm very aware of that. So yeah, it's interesting how that religious kind of fascination, attachment to EVs has now taken over to where even hybrids are considered, no, they're not really that clean, even though they're actually cleaner.
Well, and it's interesting, and I saw in your report that you cited the work from Toyota, which I thought was key, that, here's Toyota, which is a very successful automobile company, right? There's no arguing their long-term success. And they've been skeptical about fully electric vehicles for decades. And I was at a meeting in Dallas last year where they said, that we could build 90 hybrids for the amount of rare earth elements that are in one BEV. And so why are we doing this? And they were making these points fully a year ago. Now they published on that.
Even before that. I mean, they've been making those points for 5-10 years. Yeah. It's,
So it's just interesting to see how the split among the automakers in this belief, we have to chase Tesla. And Toyota said, we're not going to chase Tesla. We know who our customers are, and we're not going to do this. Whereas Mary Barra, I will point her, you said you're debating the guy at GM, and she makes this big pronouncement, the stock gets a big bump, but she's only there for a little while. So I guess, going back to the idea why the automakers did this, I think it's partly, their CEOs know they're only there for a little while, and they're going to, they have to make a bump somehow. They have to talk the walk or walk the talk or whatever it is. They have to hype out their new products, and maybe they get a stock bump if they do so. But I mean, what do you see if you look at GM? And it's not your report. Your report is very much focused on the subsidy side. What's going to happen with Ford and GM? The last of the big three that are the iconic American automakers. Are they going to have to write their investments down? What do you think is going to win the future for them?
Yeah, well, I hope the future is not taxpayers bailing them out, because that's certainly it's been done already, so it's not like we wouldn't do it again, right? We can so there to me that's a real possibility. Setting that aside, I think that they're ultimately they will have to bow to physics and economics and find their niche within the space. I mean, you got to give Tesla credit. They really out-engineered the other auto companies. I mean, they built a better system for, basically taking the limitations of the battery and working around that. Right now, there's still things they haven't solved, which is charging time, cold and hot weather operation, et cetera. But they solved a lot of the problems that the other automakers could not solve initially, and built a better mousetrap. And so I think what happened
was that because they had a clean sheet of paper because they didn't have the legacy systems that they had to
yeah,
adapt to them?
I think that's a big part of it. Yeah, they built their drivetrain and their charging system from the ground up, and they weren't burdened by, and they had better engineers. I think that's really a lot of it, and they just like I said, they out engineered them. And they also, I think the other thing they did was they saw that the luxury segment was ripe for the kind of performance benefits of EVs and also the virtue signaling, right? And so that I think that they very smartly went after that first. Now they're trying to dip down now because they're running out of room too, right? Their sales growth is slowing. They've got to dip into the larger market segments now, start cutting their prices, get the Model 3 and more mass market EVs, but it's tough. I mean, they're running into that problem too. And I think the other automakers, I think what happened is they incorrectly kind of, and I think a lot of investors too. I mean, the reason Tesla's worth so much, the market cap is so enormous, is everyone still thinks that that EVs are going to be able to capture all these other market segments.
Right.
And I think what you and I, as students of physics and economics, and who have, even though we're not in the car business, we've been at this a long time, longer than some, people in the car business have been at it, can see the trends and say, yeah, there's going to be limits to this. And I don't think, a lot of people still understand that, right? That there's limits to what the usefulness of EVs. So I think that's just where they got. So I think they'll eventually have to bow to physics and economics. And can they do that soon enough and readjust their businesses in a way that they can survive and doesn't, require us to bail them out,
Right.
And will public policy also, I mean, that's the other thing too. I mean, public policy that's kind of one of the premises of my paper, is that our policies are going to force them into bankruptcy if they, if we don't adjust, right? If we go along the path that the fuel economy regulations are setting us now, if you look at 2027 and beyond, I can't think of any automaker outside of Tesla that's going to survive that. Anyone making gas vehicles is going to try and get to where 50-60% of our vehicles are EVs by the end of this decade. That's going to send everyone into bankruptcy, and that's what I fear. So I hope that we can tamp that back. That's the hope with this paper, is that we can reel some of that back and get some realism back into this, and get back to where the policy is following the technology instead of the other way around.
Yeah. No, I like the way that you're framing that too. The technology, the technology has to come first and the policy afterwards. I'm just looking at the stock price chart for Tesla here. In let me see, late 2021, the stock price was $400. Today it's selling for under 200. So it's down.
And I think that's a reflection of the fact that there are some Tesla investors who still believe that it should be $400.
Yeah.
And that $400 is based on Tesla dominating the market. And becoming the number one automaker in the world, supplanting Toyota, right?
But their market cap is nearly
but then that's being balanced now by people who realize, like, that's might not happen. So that's dragging their price down, right?
Well, and their stock price, or their market cap, is nearly $600 billion. Toyota's $328 billion. Ford, I think, is well less than $100 billion. Yeah, $47 billion. Yeah. And, here Ford, has the most popular vehicle in America, the Ford F-150, but it's just, I think it is a sad story that Ford made such massive miscalculations in the market. And I've made the point in my Senate testimony, and we've talked about that before, but that half of the EVs in America are going into a handful of heavily Democratic counties, and and locations, that it's an identity vehicle as much as, yes, it's a performance vehicle and it's a luxury vehicle and so on, but it's about, that was the other part that to me leaves me gobsmacked, is that the automakers didn't look at this and think and understand the market and realize, oh, it's really only Democrats who are going to buy this car. And that's the Cal Berkeley report that came out last year. That's, who's going to buy this? Well, it's almost all Democrats, right? Republicans, by and large, don't want them, which is amazing to me, that the automakers wouldn't understand the marketplace to understand, well, we can't just cater to this one segment of the market that is in very liberal Democratic counties. That's not a business plan. But
Yeah.
I digress. Okay, so let me play devil's advocate for just a minute. How do you respond? I'm just throw this in there. So, here's Brent Bennett. He's TPPF. They get money from the oil and gas industry. Of course, they're crapping all over EVs.
Yeah.
This is no surprise because that was, of course, some of the. I've read some of the press criticism. Well, oh yes, here's TPPF. Texas Public Policy Foundation in Texas, right? A bunch of oil and gas guys. What a surprise! They've written a report critical of electric vehicles. How do you respond to
Yeah.
something like that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, that's why I focus on the subsidies. We have no problem with EVs. We have problem with government trying to force policy through regulation and try to force people to buy products through, regulation and subsidies, right?
Right.
That's against our core principles, right? If the government was doing the same thing with gasoline vehicles, then we'd be equally opposed to that, right?
Yeah.
If they're trying to force everyone to buy a certain kind of gas vehicle. So I think that's fundamentally what it is. And again, I mean, I'm a battery guy. I love the technology. I love working on batteries. I might do it again sometime in the future. So I think it's not about the technology. And I think part of the problem is that the subsidies and all the favoritism from the government toward EVs is what's made it politicized, right? And also kind of the religious identity, the religious nature of the progressive left's attachment to electric vehicles is what's made it so politicized, right? And if you could take that away and just look at EVs as a really cool luxury option, that some people want to buy, I think that's great. It's a great thing that batteries have gotten good enough now to where they're worthwhile for some people to put them in a car, right?
Right.
It's the fact that the government is trying to force this on everyone that I think has created the political divide and is also the reason why we're, writing about it and making a big stink about it.
Gotcha. So, in short, how I'd paraphrase that, it should be consumer pull, not government push, I guess would be
Yeah.
another way to think about it.
That's right. Right. Yeah.
So we
And
talked about
we
EVs.
should be free to choose what we buy. The government should be telling us what to buy,
Right. And yet but it's in California, it's the CARB, the administrative state, is the one that's mandating electric vehicles. Here in the US now, it's not Congress who's saying limiting or ordering the automakers. This is a proposed rule from the EPA that could lead or could force automakers by 2032, right, to sell 2/3 of their vehicles as fully electric.
That's right.
Well, so let's shift gears a little bit because we're talking about electricity and we haven't talked about the grid. And I know you've been very focused on that, and we're both in Texas, and I was blacked out in 2021. So we're coming on right about the 3-year anniversary of Winter Storm Uri. And I know TPPF has been involved in trying to get legislation passed and reform to make the grid more resilient. Is the Texas grid in better shape now than it was 3 years ago?
In some ways, yes. In some ways, no, I would say. Have we fixed a lot of the things that went wrong during Uri? I think last week was a sign that we're doing better on that. Or sorry, it was 2 weeks ago now, the storm we had 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
We had great performance from the gas and coal fleet. And of course it helped we didn't have any ice. So
Right.
we also had, wind and solar were fine because we didn't have any ice. But we had, basically as good a performance 2 weeks ago as we do out of the fleet during the summer. And so that's a really good sign. Now, granted, it was 10 degrees warmer than during Winter Storm Uri, and we didn't have any snow or ice to speak of.
Yeah.
Now, my flight through Houston got canceled on that Monday because they closed the airport, but that's just Texas being Texas.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
The power plants are running fine, So I think that a lot of that I think is being solved, and that's credit to everyone in the industry for working on that and doing it. But the market is still broken, and we haven't really we've barely added any net new dispatchable capacity. And by dispatchable I mean gas, coal, and to some extent batteries are dispatchable. Barely any since the storm. Meanwhile, we've had winter demand growth. I mean, we're probably at least 7-8% higher demand than we were 3 years ago.
Right.
It's growing at like winter demand is growing faster than summer demand, really.
Yeah.
It's growing at a rate of like 3 to 4% a year.
And
So
that's because of the heavy reliance on electric heating in
yes,
Texas, right? Versus gas heating,
right.
correct?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I was just reading about, how heat pumps are becoming more efficient, and I sure hope they are because, we're basically most of the new houses in Texas are being built using electric heat pumps.
Right.
So my old 40-year-old house has gas, and I'm happy for that. But such as it is, we're moving toward electrifying everything. The oil and gas industry here is electrifying so many things, and demand out in West Texas is growing dramatically,
Right.
right? So that demand growth. So if we didn't have demand growth, I'd say, okay, we can kind of live with what we've got. But the fact is, we've got demand growth, dramatic demand growth, and all we're doing is adding wind and solar. So
Right.
guess what happens this summer? And just 2 weeks ago, we had what the key metric is what we call net demand or net load, which is to say what your total demand is minus your wind and solar output. We set a new summer record back in September. Well, actually in August and in September, compared to what the old record was set in 2019, which was the last time we had an energy emergency, except for Uri, was in 2019, was in August 2019. So in that 4 years, we had 10 gigawatts of wind and 15 of solar added. And yet that net demand, which is the key metric to determine how much gas and coal you need, right? Because that's basically how you balance the rest of the system. That was higher in 2023 than it was 4 years prior, right? So despite this massive addition of wind and solar, we still need more dispatchable capacity than what we had 4 years ago. And again, this past week, we almost broke that record again 2 weeks ago. And it was in the winter. And I think the record will again be broken in the winter because all the solar we're adding doesn't help in the winter, right?
Right.
So that record, the last 2 weeks ago, it was at 8 a.m. There was no sun. Basically, the sun was just coming up.
Right.
So I think
And we were at about 75 gigawatts of demand, right? It was something like that, 75,
right,
77, something like that.
it was about 77, 78, and we had about 8 or 9 of wind, and so we were
Right.
just below 70 and no solar, so we were just below 70 in net demand, and that 70 gigawatt mark is kind of where our dispatchable fleet can operate at.
Uh-huh.
And so if we start to go above that consistently, then we're going to run into trouble. And again, I think because of how fast winter demand is growing, because we're not doing anything other than really building solar and some wind, that's going to be a bigger and bigger problem. So again, we fixed a lot of the things that went wrong in Uri, but we didn't fix the market. And the market is eventually going to catch up to us to where even a storm like last week is going to result in pretty big outages just because we don't have enough capacity. It's not
Yeah.
that the capacity we have isn't working, it's that we just don't have enough. And so I think Uri, in a way, was kind of the ghost of Christmas future, and this storm a couple weeks ago is also a sign that unless we fix that problem, then it's going to come back to bite us a few years down the road. So,
Well, I mean,
maybe not need to buy a generator right now, but put it on your list 3 years from now, start saving for one. And let's hope in the meantime we can get some more real market reform. I mean, the PUC just put out a document last week talking about how, all the things that they've done since Winter Storm Uri. And it's like, yeah, okay, these are all good things, but I don't see market reform on there at all. I don't see anything to counteract the impact of the federal subsidies on our market.
So the market reform? Well, so briefly, what do you mean? And when you say market reform, what are the things that need to be fixed there? Because we've talked before, and you mentioned this federal subsidies, the investment tax credit, the production tax credit. Those are the reasons that so much solar and wind is being built, right? I mean, follow the money. Why would you build anything else if you're going to get so much federal money to build solar and wind? You'd be maybe not an idiot, but not a very sharp guy if you're going to build gas or something else that's not going to give you those same kind of incentives. So, what is the market reform that you think needs to happen here?
Yeah, and I think the problem is that so far with what's been talked about and proposed for the most part, even from the PUC, is that we're basically trying to solve the problem of not having enough dispatchable generation, right? Like that's kind of how everyone thinks of the problem. You hear all our politicians kind of how they talk about it, right? And what I described was kind of why people do think of it that way, because they see like, oh, hey, we need more dispatchable generation. Like, let's go subsidize gas to try and solve that problem, basically, right? But the reason that problem exists is because we're overbuilding wind and solar because of the subsidies, right?
Right.
That's so that people need to make that leap of saying, look, there's so much money, there's only so much money in the market, right? We're paying, you pay your electric bill every month. That goes out to all the resources that are providing that electricity, right? And if you're subsidizing wind and solar, that's basically giving them a bigger piece of that pie than what they ordinarily would have, right, without the subsidies.
Right.
And so I'm not saying the pie would be zero without the subsidies, but it would not be nearly as big as it is now, right? And so until we basically solve that problem of overbuilding wind and solar, then we're always going to be chasing our tail with having to subsidize dispatchable generation to keep up, right? We're already doing it in a lot of indirect ways. We're running out of time. I could go on forever about all the extra costs that are being imposed on the system right now. Talk about why your electric bill is going up, these days, right? But the fact is that that's the fundamental problem, is that we're subsidizing these resources that provide very little capacity value. And so then we still have to find other ways to subsidize the gas generation that's needed to back them up, right? We're building two systems in a way. And unfortunately, that's, because we're not addressing the subsidies by essentially making wind and solar provide dispatchable capacity and correcting for the subsidies, right? We're falling into the same trap as California is. Yeah. Of, again, by failing to address that problem, then we need to pour money into this other side of the equation to keep the lights on, right? And so unfortunately, it's, our future is either more blackouts or a lot higher bills until we get that the wind and solar fleet right sized and get it to function in a way that actually helps the grid, instead of just kind of riding on the whole system and not providing any real capacity value and the other things that gas and coal provide, fuel security, right?
Right.
So that's what I mean by market reform.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, we're talking about market reform, because back when I wrote my first book, it was on Enron, and I remember interviewing a guy who was a former Houston natural gas guy, and he was looking at the electricity restructuring, as Ken Lay called it at that time. And he said, look, I don't see how this restructuring, how this deregulation of electricity is going to help the consumer. This is a whole other hour conversation here, but talk about the market. My friend Isaac Orr wrote a recent report for Center for the American Experiment. He published it on Substack. So there is no such thing as a market in electricity. Is it a service or is it a commodity?
Yeah. Well, I think that's the problem, is that people tend to view it as a commodity,
right?
But not all electrons are the same. Your gas and coal electrons, you can count on those well into the future. So there's capacity value, right? Because you can say, I know how much I'm going to get from these resources, roughly speaking, within a few percent. Right. On the hottest summer day 5 years from now, right? The variance in wind and solar is huge. It's, not 2 or 3%, it's like 20, 30%. So that's what when I say capacity value, that's what I mean, is that the ability to count on that capacity. There's the inertia, the ability to maintain a stable frequency in the grid, right? That the gas and coal generators can adjust to that. Wind and solar can't do that, right? So I think so we have to look at electricity as a service more than a commodity, and not price it as a commodity, which is what we do. We have a single market clearing price, right? Effectively a commodity price. Now it varies by location, right? Right. In Texas, but at each of those locations, there's a single price, and we have to somehow get away from that. And ultimately, I think competition is great, but the problem with competition is that no one is responsible for reliability. Really, ultimately, the Public Utility Commission is, but no one in the market is, right? Because so therefore, that makes the Public Utility Commission responsible, because they have to organize the market in such a way as to ensure the lights stay on. The benefit of monopolies, even though they're inefficient, is that, compared to competition, is that you have a single entity responsible for planning the system, and ensuring the lights stay on, right? So it's the synchronous nature of the grid, the fact that it all has to work together is why it's impossible to create a true market in the sense of like even in other energy commodities like oil and gas, for example, the market is more fungible because it doesn't have to be synchronized at every minute. You can store gas. You can store oil. Gas is hard to store, but you can store it.
Yeah.
You can certainly store oil. There's ways to make the market more fungible. So yeah, that's ultimately what, I think the fact that, the fact that we have competition in Texas, I think is a good thing and we can make it work. I still believe we can make it work, but we have to have a reliability standard and we have to understand that there's always going to be some form of regulation. So let's make sure that that regulation provides the best service to ratepayers. That's organized around that premise of providing the best service to ratepayers, and that hopefully over time, will create the best system. Right now it's broken. We don't know who we're trying to serve in terms of, the progressive left wants us to serve the goal of reducing emissions, and the attachment to wind and solar, right? There's the industrial consumers that kind of looking out for themselves, and they consume almost half the state's electricity, so they're a huge part of the market, right?
Yeah.
But they have different needs than you and me as residential ratepayers, right? So there's all these different entities, and we've got to get our policy focused on serving the people who need to be served the most, right? So that's providing cheap electricity for industry, but also providing reliability for the rest of us, right?
Yeah. No, as you're saying that, I'm agreeing. I'm nodding my head, thinking, yes, it's a service. We treat it like a commodity, and this restructuring that happened Enron led this, right? Enron led this now 24 years ago. And we're going to allow this competition. It's going to be great. And so there was conservatives can say, oh yeah, well, competition, we're all for that. And the liberals could say, oh yeah, wind and solar, we love Enron. And so it was just a confluence of a very interesting coalition. But now here 20 plus years later in Texas, of all places, we're still now litigating what this should look like and how this new system, we're calling it a market, but the more regulation you put in, the less and less it looks like a market. And instead, you've got to tip the scale. So you've got to put your thumb on the scale for one form or another in order to make sure the thing works in terms of reliability. And I think you're exactly right that here still 3 years after Winter Storm Uri, no one is responsible for reliability. The buck doesn't stop anywhere if the system fails.
Yeah. Yeah. And ultimately, like I said, the legislature and the Public Utility Commission need to, in the next couple of years need to look, we're going to all come together on a reliability standard that suits us. And then we're going to do what's needed to meet that. And again, we're not going to try and it's not about being fair to fossil fuels or to, wind and solar. It's about serving ratepayers,
Right.
And providing the best service for ratepayers. So we have to have that as our organizing principle.
Preach it, brother. Amen. The ratepayers, the forgotten person here.
If I can change anything, I would hope that we can be a voice for preaching that being an organizing principle, and form our policy recommendations and research around that. So we can try and get that back into the system. But we'll see. It's tough because there's money to be made in all parts of the market, and people are rent seeking everywhere. Yeah, and there's really no one looking out for the ratepayers except for the folks up there at the Capitol who need to hear from the ratepayers and serve them ultimately. So I think there are, and I think there are plenty of legislators who have that in their minds, but it's hard. It's easy to forget that when you're hearing from so many different lobbying entities. And like you said, it's not. And a market naturally serves its customers, right? That's what you're talking about. It's like markets are built around consumer demand,
Right.
It's just not quite that way in electricity, and so we have to regulate in such a way as to create the right conditions for that.
Right. Well, and it's become such a complex system. I mean, it's just the complexity of it is truly staggering. And in Texas, of course, it's even more complex because it's such a big state. And, the electricity market in the U.S. retail sales are about $500 billion a year. Texas is what, uh, 10, well, 15% of that, something like that. So
Hmm.
it's an enormous chunk,
A lot of money.
75
A
billion
lot of
dollars a
money.
year, something like that. So Brent, you've been on the podcast before, so I have two final questions I ask everybody, and I know you have a new baby, but nevertheless,
Yeah.
what are you reading? What's on the top of your book pile these days?
Yeah. A lot of kids books. So, the Madeline
Dr. Seuss
children's
and
stories.
yeah.
Yeah, Cat in the Hat, and all that. Yeah, so I've memorized a lot of kids' books, Paw Patrol. Yeah, read those every night to the kids. But for my personal reading, actually, you gave me a copy of Question of Power, and that's actually next on my reading list, is your book. So I'm hoping to get to that soon. I'm reading a book about emotional fitness right now from a Christian writer and kind of therapist about how to become more emotionally fit, right? To be able to read other people's emotions and also control your own. As a kind of nerdy scientist guy, it's not something I've ever done much of. But when you have kids and you're trying to relate to them, and you're in a job like this that you got to relate to people every day, it's important to be emotionally, have a good high emotional IQ, right? So, but yeah, but I'm really excited to read your book next. I'm going to get to it here soon.
Attaboy. Well, thanks for the plug.
Yeah.
What gives you hope then, Brent? Last question. You look around the world, there are a lot of things that you can be pessimistic about. What gives you hope?
Yeah. Yeah, I know. We just spent an hour complaining about public policy, right? I think what gives me hope is that people still want freedom, and people still want cheap, affordable energy, affordable, reliable energy, and that in spite of the forces that are arrayed against freedom and affordable, reliable energy, people ultimately resist that, and people don't for long accept authoritarianism. Eventually, it does give way to freedom over time, and we've seen it throughout the course of human history. And I think even as freedom might ebb and flow in our country, that people are ultimately going to lean toward that. You're seeing in Europe now the backlash against net zero and globalism now in Europe is starting to come to bear, and so I think that will, I have a lot of faith in people always desiring those things, and that ultimately is going to, in our own haphazard way, lead us toward, making things better for our children and grandchildren than it was for us. So
Well, that's a good place to stop.
yeah,
My guest has been Brent Bennett. He is the policy director for Life Powered, which is an initiative of the Texas Public Policy Foundation. You can find his report that he wrote with Jason Isaac called Overcharged Expectations: Unmasking the True Costs of Electric Vehicles on the Texas Public Policy Foundation website. Brent, thanks for coming on the podcast again. This has been great fun.
thank you, Robert. Appreciate it.
And thanks to all of you out there in podcast land for tuning into this episode of the Power Hungry Podcast. Tune out for the next one. It might be as good as this one. And if you're so inclined, give us a 5-star rating, recommend us, all that stuff on your favorite podcast channel. Okay, until then, see you next time.